All right, let's dive in. We're looking at expert witness testimony today, the kind that can really impact an asylum case. We've got this report by Maxim Kurytenov. Seems to be quite the authority on Russia and post-Soviet countries.
Yeah, his background is fascinating. Not just some academic, He's actually lived through a lot of what he's an expert on. Imagine being granted refugee status in the UK because of your anti-corruption work in Russia. That's some serious firsthand experience.
Makes you think, how does someone go from being a victim of that kind of system to helping others escape it?
Well, he's got the credentials, for sure, a law degree from Moscow Law University, but it's
Yeah.
that personal experience, right? Probably gives him a whole other level of insight into the legal systems and into, like, the human cost of it all.
In his YouTube channel, Human Rights, that's pretty telling too.
Oh, definitely. Shows a real commitment to bringing these issues to light. I mean, we're talking Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Georgia. He's got expertise on a whole range of post-Soviet countries, everything from political persecution to, even things like forced marriage.
Which brings us to the case at the heart of this deep dive, Mrs. Asylum case.
Mm.
What can you tell us about her situation and how Maxim's expertise comes in?
Okay, so picture this. You're forced into a marriage you don't want, threats are coming from your own father, and there's absolutely nowhere to turn for help. That was Mrs. Reality in Russia. She managed to flee, used a pre-planned trip to the UK as her way out.
I'm guessing that escape wasn't exactly the end of her problems.
Oh, not even close. Turns out she's a dual citizen, Russia and Ukraine. Throws a whole other wrench into the legal process.
I can see how that complicates things. But why is dual nationality such a big deal in an asylum case like this? Wouldn't it give her more options?
You'd think so, but not really. See, the UK can't just deport her to Ukraine. Both countries have a claim, and with the conflict going on between them, UK has to tread carefully. Gotta consider the risks she faces in both places.
So it's not just about escaping one dangerous situation. It's this whole web of, like, geopolitical stuff, legal hurdles.
Exactly. And then there's the family to consider. Her partner and children are undocumented Albanian nationals.
So even if she does find safety in the UK, her family might not be able to join her.
Big question mark. And that's where Maxim's expertise really shines. What are the chances of family reunification? Are there legal precedents? And even if they could relocate, what risks are they facing in Russia, Ukraine, even Albania?
Wow, this really shows how all these issues are tied together. Personal safety, family, international relations, and then the legal systems on top of it all.
Yeah, and it underscores why someone like Maxim is so important. He doesn't just present the facts, he analyzes them through this lens of expertise, helps the legal team, and ultimately the court, grasp just how complicated Mrs. situation really is.
Okay, so she's escaped a dangerous situation. Dual nationality makes things extra tricky. But there's even more to her story, isn't there?
Definitely. The report mentions she's been pretty vocal about her pro-Ukrainian sympathies, didn't shy away from disagreeing with the Russian government, and in this political climate, that's a risky move.
Chilling reminder that freedom of speech is not something everyone enjoys.
Absolutely. And that raises the stakes for Mrs. Bat. It's not just about escaping a forced marriage anymore. It's this very real fear of persecution for her beliefs. If she has to go back to Russia, who knows what could happen?
And that's where Maxim's expertise on political persecution becomes so important, right?
You got it. He can assess the level of risk she faces based on the current political climate, similar cases. And he's got that network of contacts in the region. His insights could literally be the difference between her finding safety or being sent back into a very dangerous situation.
So escaping threats, navigating this complex legal system because of her dual nationality, and now the potential for political persecution, it's a lot to unpack. But I have a feeling the challenges don't end there, do they?
Sadly, no. The report goes into some of the practical difficulties she's facing. Things that might seem basic, like finding housing, become major obstacles.
Wait, even finding a place to live is a problem. I mean, Moscow is a huge city.
You'd think, right. But the report paints a different picture. Even finding safe and affordable housing in Moscow, or really anywhere in Russia, it's a real challenge, especially for someone starting from scratch, limited resources.
So it's like she escaped one danger only to face a different kind, the threat of being homeless, being unstable.
Right. And on top of that, the security situation. The report mentions that Mrs. Parental home in Crimea, it was bombed, just highlights the very real danger of this ongoing conflict.
That's awful. It makes you realize this conflict, it's not just some abstract thing, It has real devastating consequences for people.
Absolutely. And it makes travel to and from Ukraine incredibly dangerous, particularly for areas like Crimea. So even if she could find housing in Russia, getting there safely is another hurdle.
It sounds like she's in a very precarious situation, facing challenges on so many different levels.
And that's exactly why Maxim's expertise is so vital. He doesn't just present the facts, he provides the context, the analysis, the insight that helps paint a complete picture. His report, it's like a roadmap, guiding the legal team through all the complexities.
Which ultimately helps ensure that Mrs. Case is handled fairly with the sensitivity it deserves. But before we go too deep into the legal side of things, let's step back. What does her story tell us about the bigger picture, about the state of human rights in Russia and other post-Soviet countries?
That's a great question, and one that Maxim's work helps us answer. We'll dive into that more in the next part of our deep dive. It's easy to kind of get lost in the specifics of Mrs. Case, but her story, it really points to some bigger issues, the kind of issues Maxim's work keeps bringing to light.
You're right. It's like her experience is like a microcosm of what so many people face in these regions. So what can we learn from her case about the state of human rights in Russia and in other post-Soviet countries?
Well, for one thing, it kind of shatters this idea that these countries have, fully moved on from their Soviet past. Corruption, political repression, human rights violations, it's all still deeply ingrained in many of these systems.
And those aren't just abstract concepts. We're seeing the real-world impact on people like Mrs. K.
Exactly. Her fear, the lack of basic protections, the constant threat of violence. This is everyday life for a lot of people in these regions. It's about more than just like political movements or failures in the system. It's about individual rights and freedoms being eroded.
It really makes the work of organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch seem even more crucial.
Absolutely. They're vital for documenting these abuses, pushing for change, holding those in power accountable. But what's interesting about Maxim's work is that he doesn't just rely on those official reports and news articles.
You're talking about his network of contacts, right? The report mentioned he taps into sources within law enforcement in Russia, Ukraine, even the UK.
Exactly. It's like having access to this inside track, He can corroborate or challenge the official story, get a more accurate, more complete picture.
It makes you wonder how much information is, suppressed or maybe even distorted for political reasons.
It's a valid concern. Governments and official sources, they often have their own agenda. That's why having experts like Maxim who can dig deeper, use alternative sources, that's so important. He can offer a more objective view.
He's almost like an investigative journalist, piecing together the truth, using documents, media reports, and then those personal contacts.
Great analogy. He's not just making a legal argument, he's uncovering these hidden details, shining a light on realities that might otherwise stay hidden.
Which brings us back to the human element of all this. We can't forget about Mrs. Family. What does the report say about their situation?
Heartbreaking, really. Her partner and children, they're undocumented Albanian nationals. Creates all sorts of legal hurdles.
Seems like every time they take a step forward, there's another roadblock. They must feel so trapped.
It really highlights how political conflicts and immigration policies, they have these ripple effects. They're not just abstract legal matters, they impact real families with real consequences.
I can't even imagine that stress, that uncertainty, not knowing if you can stay together, if you'll be separated, if you'll ever find somewhere you can truly call home.
Right. It reminds us that behind every asylum case, there's a human story. A story of love, loss, resilience, and just this unwavering hope for a better future.
It also makes you think about how we, as a global community, approach these issues. Are we doing enough to protect those who are fleeing danger? Are our systems actually upholding the dignity and rights of everyone?
Those are the questions we need to be asking. And while we're on the topic of global perspectives, there's something else about Maxim's work that I find fascinating. It's his use of technology.
Right. The YouTube channel. He's not just sharing his expertise. It's a form of advocacy, too, isn't it?
Exactly. He's using that platform to raise awareness, connect with other experts and activists, and, give a voice to those who are often silenced.
Shows how technology can be a powerful tool for change, for building a global community that stands up for human rights and justice.
It's a good reminder that we're not just passive bystanders. We all have a part to play in shaping a more just and compassionate world. And, speaking of action, something that really stood out to me in the report was Maxim's analysis of why Mrs. hesitated to claim asylum when she first got to the UK.
I remember that. Seemed kind of counterintuitive. Wouldn't someone escaping danger immediately seek asylum?
You'd think, right. It's a common assumption. But it's rarely that simple.
So what made her hesitate?
Several factors, probably. Put yourself in her shoes. She's in a foreign country, doesn't know the language, the customs. There might be uncertainty about the process, fear of the unknown, maybe even distrust of authorities based on her experiences back in Russia.
And then there's the emotional impact of everything she's been through. Trauma can make it so hard to, think clearly, act rationally.
Exactly. And Maxim's understanding of those psychological barriers is so important. It helps us see that asylum seekers, they're not just legal cases, they're real people, dealing with really complex emotions and making really tough choices.
Reminds us to approach these situations with empathy, you know,
Hmm.
with understanding. Now, there's another disturbing element in the report we need to talk about, the potential involvement of criminal groups.
Yeah, that's a chilling part of the story. The report mentions an encounter Mrs. had in Manchester. There were some individuals she met who might have been involved in criminal activities.
That's a scary thought. Someone fleeing danger could end up in an even more vulnerable position, especially in a new country where they don't know the rules, who to trust.
And it highlights another layer of complexity that experts like Maxime have to deal with. It's not just the political climate, the legal stuff, it's the possibility of organized crime exploitation within these systems.
Like peeling back the layers of an onion, each layer reveals another challenge for someone seeking asylum.
Right, it stresses the need for comprehensive support for asylum seekers. They need more than just legal aid, help with housing, language skills, integrating into the culture, and, protection from people who might take advantage of them.
It's about creating a safety net.
Yeah.
So those fleeing danger don't fall through the cracks, become even more vulnerable. We're running out of time, though. How can we tie all this together?
Let's shift gears, focus on the bigger picture. The broader implications of Mrs. Case, what lessons can we learn? That's what we'll explore as we move into the final part of our deep dive.
We've really gone deep into Maxim Kurytenov's work and into Mrs. Asylum Case. It's been amazing to see how her personal story connects to these bigger issues. Human rights, international relations, and even the systems that are supposed to be protecting vulnerable people.
Yeah, it really brings it home, doesn't it? That these aren't just abstract ideas we're talking about. They have real consequences. They shape people's lives, whole families.
So as we wrap up, let's zoom out a bit. What are the big takeaways here? What can we learn from Mrs.'s story and from Maxim's work?
Well, I think one of the most important things is just how crucial expertise is in these complicated cases. Someone like Maxim, with his knowledge of the region, the legal ins and outs, the cultural nuances, he can really bridge that gap, between the asylum seeker story and the legal system, which can feel very impersonal.
Like he's translating so the courts can really understand, making sure Mrs.'s voice is heard.
Exactly. And it also shows how limiting it can be to only rely on official sources. Governments, they have their agendas, and information can be hidden, twisted.
Which is where Maxim's network of contacts is so valuable. He can get a more complete picture, challenge the official story. Ultimately, it's about a more accurate, more balanced view of what's happening.
Another key takeaway is how interconnected all these issues are. Mrs. Case, it's not just about domestic violence or political persecution. It's all these things tied together. Personal safety, family, international relations, legal systems.
It shows how one person's story can really open our eyes to how complicated the world is and make us think harder about the systems we've built.
Her story definitely highlights the challenges to human rights in Russia and in other post-Soviet countries. They've moved on from the Soviet era, but so many are still dealing with corruption, repression, and just a lack of basic protections for people.
It's a reminder that the fight for human rights is not over. But even with these challenges, there are glimmers of hope, right?
Oh, absolutely. Organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, people like Maxim Kurytenov, and countless others, all fighting for justice and equality, they give us a different perspective, a hopeful one.
And technology is becoming more and more important, helping those voices be heard, connecting people across borders.
Maxim's YouTube channel, that's a prime example. He's raising awareness, sharing information, building this global community that supports human rights.
It's inspiring to see people using their expertise and their platforms to make a real difference.
And it reminds us that we're not powerless. We can all do something. Support organizations doing the work, stay informed, talk to our elected officials.
We can use our voices, too. Speak out against injustice, stand up for what's right, stand up for everyone's rights.
In the end, it's about recognizing our shared humanity. Working together to build a world where seeking asylum isn't this desperate act of survival, but a process that respects everyone's dignity, everyone's rights.
Powerful way to put it. This deep dive has been quite a journey into the complexities of this legal case, into this woman's story, and into the challenges facing our world today.
And as we wrap up, I'd encourage everyone to think about what you've learned and how you can use it in your own life. Even the smallest actions can have an impact.
If this has sparked your interest and you want to explore more, definitely check out Maxim Kurytenov's work. His YouTube channel, Human Rights, is a great place to start.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep working towards a better world.